Imagine waking up to an ultimatum that could change the course of history. Europe has given Russia just 48 hours to respond to a shocking demand. Will Putin comply, or are we on the brink of a crisis? This is the Conflict Daily podcast channel.
Okay, let's unpack this. Tonight, we are tackling a piece of political theater so high stakes it feels ripped straight from a history textbook. We're talking about Europe's 48-hour ultimatum to Russia.
It really is something, and what's so fascinating here is that this isn't just a new set of sanctions. It signifies a profound philosophical shift in strategy.
A shift how?
Well, we are moving entirely away from calibrated pressure, the kind designed to leave room for negotiation. We're moving into the realm of deadline diplomacy, which historically is probably the most dangerous playbook there is.
Right.
The sources we're looking at are analyzing not just the demands themselves, but the immense structural risks this move creates for European cohesion, for global security, for everyone.
So our deep dive mission is simple. We want to cut through the immediate drama to understand the specific, non-negotiable demands Europe has made. We also want to get into the deep calculations behind why leaders decided to risk a total rupture now, and crucially, why history shows us that ultimatums are often the fastest on-ramp to catastrophe.
Exactly.
We are helping you, the listener, understand the precise, inflexible line that has just been drawn in the sand and the terrifying consequences of crossing it.
Indeed. For nearly 3 years, the narrative has been one of slow, predictable escalation. Now, that entire framework is just shattered.
Yeah.
We're in a high-velocity, zero-sum game now, forcing a binary decision in this compressed time frame.
Yeah.
And, examining the historical echoes of this is just vital to grasping how serious it is.
Okay, so let's start with who issued this thing. Who is standing on the European side of the table? Because the sources describe this as extraordinary and unprecedented.
They do, and for good reason. This is a declaration of massive, unified economic and diplomatic weight. The ultimatum was formally issued by the collective European Union.
The whole bloc.
The whole bloc. But critically, they were not alone. They were joined by key geopolitical players: Britain, Norway, and maybe most importantly, neutral Switzerland.
Wait, okay, let's pause on that. Why is Switzerland's inclusion so significant? They're famously non-aligned.
Switzerland's participation is a huge diplomatic signal. When a country that prides itself on neutrality, on financial stability, on keeping channels open with everyone, when they sign on to a declaration calling a major power's behavior intolerable.
It sends a message.
A huge one. It says the violation of international norms is now so egregious that even the most neutral parties feel compelled to take a side. It pools their massive financial power, especially with all those frozen assets with the EU and the UK. It gives the threat maximum weight.
Okay, and the demands themselves are extremely specific. This isn't some vague plea for de-escalation. It's built around 3 core concessions Russia has to make.
And they're all tied directly to the military and humanitarian situation in Ukraine. And these demands, I have to say, would be incredibly difficult for Putin to accept.
Why so difficult?
Because they require Russia to abandon strategic objectives and military gains that it has invested massive resources into over the last 3 years. Politically, at home, that's almost an impossible sell.
Okay, so let's start with the first demand, the humanitarian one.
The first is an immediate cessation of all attacks on civilian infrastructure in Ukraine.
And this isn't just, collateral damage. This is a specific strategy.
Absolutely. This goes way beyond standard battlefield operations. It demands an end to the calculated, deliberate targeting of essential services. Power plants, water pumping stations, heating infrastructure.
The kinds of things designed to make life impossible for civilians, especially in winter.
Precisely. These attacks are timed and designed to degrade the very ability of Ukrainian cities to sustain life. From Russia's perspective, this strategy is essential. It degrades Ukrainian resistance not just militarily, but psychologically. It forces the state to divert huge resources to repairs.
The ultimatum demands they stop a key pillar of their war effort. Just stop.
Instantly, yes.
Okay, and the second demand. That takes us into nuclear security.
It does. It focuses on Europe's largest nuclear facility, the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. The demand is a full withdrawal of all Russian forces from the plant.
The ZNPP. A huge facility, 6 reactors.
It's enormous. And its continued military occupation poses this just unacceptable risk of a catastrophic release. But the demand isn't just for the plant itself, it's for the entire surrounding strategic fortified territory.
Why is that surrounding territory so vital?
Because that area is strategically critical. Russian forces have used the area around the plant as a massive fortified military base. They're exploiting the belief that Ukrainian forces won't risk artillery strikes near a nuclear facility.
They're using it as a shield.
A human shield, but with a nuclear reactor. Relinquishing that territory means giving up a major defensive position on the bank of the Dnieper River. It undermines their control over huge segments of occupied land. I mean, these positions have been reinforced for years. Tunnels, bunkers. To just give them up would be politically humiliating and militarily costly.
Wow. Okay, and the third demand. This one is about global economics, food security.
Right. It demands the immediate restoration of the grain export agreements that Russia unilaterally terminated earlier this year.
So letting Ukrainian grain get out through the Black Sea.
Yes, and crucially, the sources note this requires Russia to accept terms it already rejected, terms that ensure safe passage for Ukrainian exports without the immediate lifting of Western sanctions on Russian agricultural products, which was Putin's main reason for pulling out of the deal in the first place.
So to sum it up, Putin has to stop a key part of his military strategy, surrender a major fortified position, and accept trade terms he previously called unacceptable.
And he has 48 critical hours to do it all.
So what's the consequence? What happens if he just says no?
Well, the deadline is a hard clock.
Yeah.
He has 48 hours to respond affirmatively to all three. The threat isn't just another layer of sanctions. European officials are threatening, and I'm quoting here, unprecedented economic and diplomatic isolation that will make all previous sanctions look mild by comparison.
That is a stunning statement. I mean, we've seen them cut off from SWIFT, central bank assets frozen. How could it get worse?
To understand the magnitude, you have to look at what's left. The initial sanctions were designed to be painful but targeted. They left some things on the table, like certain energy flows.
Right.
This new threat means complete indiscriminate severance. It means moving from freezing assets to talking about outright seizing them. It means a full mandatory withdrawal of every single European company still operating in Russia.
So they're threatening to cut the last remaining threads of the entire economic relationship.
That's it exactly. The statement threatens a rupture so complete that officials are warning restoration might take generations. We are talking about total economic isolation from the continent. This is a level of isolation that's really only been tried against states like North Korea or Iran, and never against an economy the size of Russia's.
Which brings us to this idea of the end of incrementalism. For years, the strategy was calibrated escalation, sanctions in waves, always keeping something in reserve. Why is this ultimatum the end of that?
Because that gradual approach was rooted in the belief that Russia could be coerced slowly and that Europe needed to protect itself economically. This ultimatum signals the total exhaustion of that patience. The EU has effectively said the era of gradual escalation is over because it didn't work.
Right.
They're prioritizing deterrence and immediate results over gradual pressure. This isn't about another sanctions list. It's about drawing a non-negotiable line in the sand.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Why do this now? I mean, why risk a total rupture after 3 years of this patient incremental pressure? Why abandon a strategy that, at least in theory, kept the door slightly ajar for dialogue?
The primary driver, according to the officials our sources spoke with, was just profound multi-layered frustration.
Frustration that the sanctions weren't working.
Exactly. They concluded that the incremental strategy had failed to change Russian behavior in any significant way. It produced, as one source put it, incremental results at best. They reasoned that continuing with calibrated pressure just gave Russia more time to adapt.
And that failure fueled a lot of internal political pressure.
Immense pressure from multiple sides. Domestically, European publics were getting frustrated that sanctions hadn't ended the war and were contributing to inflation. Ukrainian officials, of course, were demanding stronger, more immediate action. And, critically, the Eastern European member states, Poland, the Baltics, they were arguing that Western restraint just enabled Russia's aggression to continue.
Enable them to find workarounds and just wait it out.
Precisely. For 3 years, Russia expertly countered sanctions with all these evasion tactics. They used third parties, parallel imports, they shifted energy sales to Asia, they exploited every bit of ambiguous diplomatic language, they dragged out negotiations, and just outlasted the Western attention span.
So the ultimatum wasn't just a reflex. It was intentionally designed to cut off those evasion tactics.
That's the calculated brilliance of it, if it works. The 48-hour deadline is the key. It eliminates ambiguity. It eliminates delay. It forces a decision in a time frame where you can't develop workarounds, you can't find new supply chains, and the world's attention is focused by that ticking clock.
It still feels like a massive high-stakes bet. What are European leaders really gambling on here?
They're gambling on the belief that this time the threat is so comprehensive that it overcomes Russia's proven tolerance for pain. They're betting that, quote, concentrated pressure with a clear deadline will succeed, where gradual pressure without deadlines has failed.
And their calculation rests on Putin's vulnerability to his own elites.
That's right. They calculate that he faces this mounting pressure from oligarchs, technocrats, resource executives, people whose wealth and access to European life have been just devastated by frozen assets and travel bans.
They think the accumulated pain has weakened his hand enough.
Weakened it enough that the risk of total economic isolation will force him to choose the path of lesser pain, which, in their view, is compliance.
But the sources also reveal that getting to this point, to issuing the ultimatum, was not easy. There were significant divisions inside Europe about this very idea of inflexibility.
Oh, absolutely. The decision was far from unanimous. The internal talks revealed these really significant ideological divisions. The core dilemma was, do we keep the door open for negotiation, or do we slam it shut to show we're serious?
And who was arguing to keep the door open?
French President Emmanuel Macron, he was representing that more traditional dialogue-focused diplomacy. He argued really strongly for including escape clauses that would allow talks to extend beyond 48 hours if Russia showed even a tiny bit of willingness to engage.
His fear was locking everyone into an uncontrollable spiral.
Exactly. But then you had the other side.
And who was pushing for the rigidity that we saw in the final text?
That was primarily German officials. They were reflecting a deeper, I think, historical skepticism toward Russian diplomatic stalling. They argued that previous flexibility, the very clauses Macron was proposing, had been consistently exploited by Putin to just drag out negotiations forever without ever making real concessions.
So them, the deadline was the message.
The deadline was the entire point, yes.
So how did they resolve that, between flexibility and rigidity?
The final compromise is just a masterclass in diplomatic tension. It tries to do both things and risks failing at both. The official text has the strict German position, a hard 48-hour clock, but they included this carefully worded language reportedly at the insistence of the French, suggesting that a substantive Russian response within 48 hours could lead to negotiations about implementation timelines.
That sounds like a diplomatic pressure release valve that could fail the first time it's used.
It really does. I mean, this compromise reveals the whole tension in their strategy. They want to force a decision with the deadline, but they're leaving this tiny, ambiguous off-ramp so that neither side is locked into a catastrophe if the response is just a little bit ambiguous.
But the core dilemma is still there. It might not be strict enough to force compliance, but it's definitely rigid enough to trigger escalation if Putin sees it as an insult.
Exactly. They traded clarity for consensus, and in the process, they may have created a really unstable foundation for the next 48 hours.
To really understand the gravity of what's happening, we have to pull back and look at history. The sources are so clear on this. Ultimatums are the most dangerous form of diplomacy. Why is that the consensus?
Because they strip away all the safety mechanisms of diplomacy. They create these artificial public deadlines that eliminate the flexibility you need for face-saving compromises. They force major powers into a zero-sum choice: publicly back down and risk political collapse at home, or commit to a catastrophic follow-through.
And the classic example, the ultimate cautionary tale, is of course the lead-up to World War I, the July crisis of 1914.
The July crisis is the perfect demonstration of how ultimatums create this irreversible momentum toward war. After the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, Austria-Hungary, with Germany's backing, issued an ultimatum to Serbia.
And the demands were basically impossible for any sovereign nation to accept.
They were. They went so far beyond just punishing the assassins. They demanded Serbia suppress all anti-Austrian publications, dissolve nationalist groups, and this was the real sticking point, allow Austro-Hungarian officials to participate within Serbia's own territory in the investigation.
So letting a foreign power conduct police operations on your soil, an undeniable attack on sovereignty.
No question. And the deadline attached to these impossible demands was just 48 hours. The historical record is clear that this timeline was deliberately designed to be too short. It was meant to ensure Serbia would either capitulate completely or fail, giving Austria its pretext for war.
In Serbia, recognizing this, accepted almost everything.
Almost everything. All but that one point about Austrian officials on their soil. But partial compliance was treated as a full rejection. Austria declared war immediately, and that triggered the cascade of alliances. Russia mobilizing to help Serbia, Germany demanding Russia stop, France mobilizing to help Russia. The deadlines created a momentum that the politicians just could not stop.
And it kept going. Germany then issued its own ultimatum to Russia to demobilize. The deadline on that one was just 12 hours.
An impossible timeline. It's just
Wow.
once the mechanism of the ultimatum starts, it demands action that may not even be logistically possible. The lesson of 1914 is terrifying. Artificial time limits prevent careful thought and force a choice between war and political suicide.
Okay, so that's the model of a catastrophic failure of an ultimatum. But history also gives us a catastrophic success, the Munich crisis of 1938.
Right. Munich showed how deadlines can successfully get you massive concessions without an immediate war. But the cost is a moral failure and eventually a much bigger conflict. In 1938, Hitler issued ultimatums to Czechoslovakia demanding the Sudeten territories, threatening invasion if his deadlines weren't met.
And the Western powers, Britain and France, pressured Czechoslovakia to give in.
They did. Chamberlain and Daladier pressured them to accept the demands rather than face a German attack alone. Czechoslovakia complied, under duress, and the immediate result was peace in our time, as Chamberlain famously said.
But the sources stress this was a catastrophic success. Why?
Because yielding to the deadline pressure just signaled to Hitler that his strategy of coercion worked. It confirmed his belief that the Western democracies didn't have the will to fight. So that success just encouraged him to issue more and more aggressive ultimatums to Poland, for instance, which ultimately led to World War II.
So a successful coercion today can lead to a much more confident and aggressive confrontation tomorrow.
That's the chilling lesson.
So if those are the warnings, is there a case where a high-stakes confrontation was handled correctly? The sources point to the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962.
The Cuban Missile Crisis is the essential contrast. It was absolutely coercive diplomacy. Kennedy demanded the Soviets remove missiles from Cuba and impose a naval quarantine, which was an implicit threat of military action.
That's the key difference.
The key difference is that Kennedy deliberately avoided explicit, public, inflexible deadlines.
Then why was avoiding that 48-hour clock so critical in 1962?
Kennedy's team understood that rigid public deadlines corner your adversary. They strip away their ability to retreat without catastrophic political loss. By avoiding that, he kept private communication channels open. The famous back channel through his brother, Robert Kennedy, to the Soviet ambassador.
Which allowed for a negotiated way out.
Exactly. This flexibility let both sides craft a solution: Soviet missiles out of Cuba in exchange for a public pledge not to invade and a secret deal to remove U.S. missiles from Turkey. Both Khrushchev and Kennedy could claim success at home. They avoided the appearance of capitulation.
Which brings us back to today. When we look at this European ultimatum, it seems like they've ignored the lessons of 1962 and mirrored the dangerous rigidity of 1914.
They really have. A short deadline that limits negotiation, comprehensive demands that require massive political concessions, and a public statement that makes it politically costly for anyone to back down. They have chosen the high-risk path.
Let's pivot now to Moscow and try to analyze the countercalculus. Europe's wager is fundamentally economic, that the pain is just too high for Putin to ignore. But what is the cost of compliance for Putin's political survival?
This is the really uncomfortable heart of the matter. In Russia, especially right now, complying with explicit Western demands looks weak domestically, and weakness is seen as a profound vulnerability. The sources warn that the main risk of compliance is triggering an elite revolt from the hardliners who are Putin's core power base.
Tell us more about these hardliners. Who are they?
They're the Siloviki, the security and intelligence officials, key military commanders, and these extreme nationalist pro-war movements. They see any accommodation with the West as an act of capitulation. It's a betrayal of their entire project of restoring Russian national interests.
So if Putin complies, say, by pulling back from Zaporizhia, they would see that as proof that he can no longer defend Russian interests.
Precisely. It would shatter the whole narrative of unwavering Russian strength. It creates an immediate political opening for challengers who could argue, if the West threatens strongly enough, Putin buckles. Putin's political survival, based on this analysis, requires him to avoid even the appearance of yielding to Western pressure.
Okay, but let's go back to Europe's calculation, the optimistic side of the wager. Why do they think he'll overcome those domestic risks?
European leaders are betting that the accumulated pain has reached a tipping point. They're arguing that the economic costs are now a greater threat to Putin's stability than the hardliners are. They think the pressure from the financial elites, whose wealth has just been devastated, will outweigh the influence of the military factions.
And their argument is that the Russian economy just can't sustain this long term.
Correct. They believe it can't sustain total isolation from European high-tech markets and finance. While Russia has survived the initial sanctions, the prolonged lack of access to critical Western spare parts and specialized machinery is now crippling sectors far removed from the war, like civil aviation and energy extraction,
So they're betting that these slow-burn economic injuries are about to break the system.
and force Putin to seek relief. They also point to the massive military setbacks, 300,000 casualties, thousands of lost tanks, as something that's weakening his political foundation and fueling grumbling among the elites.
Which brings us to the uncomfortable truth of this wager. Europe is making a rational economic bet. Extreme pain will equal compliance. But is Putin making a rational economic decision or a political survival decision?
That is the ultimate, terrifying question here. The assumption that Putin prioritizes economic recovery over his own political survival in the face of hardline opposition. That is the central risk of this entire strategy.
I mean, he has spent 3 years showing a willingness to accept enormous costs.
Truly enormous costs, economic decline, industrial stagnation, massive casualties, rather than appear to yield. The idea that a 48-hour deadline creates a qualitatively different calculus than months of sanctions, well, it requires you to believe this new pressure will suddenly overcome his fundamental political instinct, which is to resist submission.
So he might actually calculate that defiance is the safer move for him, personally.
He very well might. He could calculate that refusing the ultimatum, accepting the economic catastrophe, and then blaming Europe for all of Russia's suffering actually serves his political survival better than complying. Defiance satisfies the powerful hardliners, ensuring his immediate political longevity, even if it accelerates the country's long-term decline.
And there's a practical logistical problem here too, right? Even if Putin wanted to comply, is it even possible in 48 hours?
That's a critical point. The deadline is so short that compliance might be logistically impossible. Think about it. Withdrawing military forces from a massive fortified nuclear facility takes weeks of complex planning. Restructuring global grain export agreements requires high-level negotiations.
So even if the Kremlin decides, yes, they can't physically deliver on the demands in 2 days.
Correct. The timeline just doesn't allow for the necessary internal consultations and operational shifts. It's designed to force a clear, immediate political response, yes or no, rather than facilitate any kind of genuine phased negotiation. This rigidity just maximizes the probability of defiance.
Now we face the critical moment. If Putin defies this, European leaders have to make a choice. They've made these explicit public threats. They have to either follow through or retreat and damage their credibility forever.
It's a moment of truth. If Europe retreats, it demonstrates that their threats lack credibility. Putin would have successfully called their bluff, proving that Western unity crumbles when the economic pain becomes too intense. That just emboldens future aggression.
Okay, but let's assume they follow through. What are the catastrophic consequences for Russia of this total economic isolation? Let's get specific.
If Europe pulls that trigger, Russia is looking at an economic shock far worse than anything they've experienced. Potentially a double-digit GDP decline within a year. A genuine structural collapse.
And it goes beyond energy.
Way beyond. It means cutting off European markets for all other Russian exports. Aluminum, palladium, nickel, chemicals. It would eliminate access to European high technology, spare parts, maintenance software. Think of their civil aviation fleet. It would be grounded. The specialized pumps for energy extraction, mostly European-made, they'd stop working.
And financially, what happens to Russian assets?
European banks would be completely prohibited from any transactions with Russian entities. And those hundreds of billions in sovereign assets that are currently frozen, they would likely move to full, immediate seizure to fund Ukraine reconstruction, a financial catastrophe for the Kremlin.
So the pain is immense for Russia. But the sources are clear. It's not unilateral. What are the significant costs for European economies if they pull this trigger?
The pain for Europe is real and immediate. First, the complete elimination of any remaining Russian energy imports. That would cause another spike in energy prices, hitting consumers and manufacturing firms right away.
And what about European businesses still in Russia?
Massive losses. They would forfeit assets worth tens of billions of euros, factories, retail operations. Those forfeitures translate directly into write-downs, reduced profits, and substantial job losses back home across the continent. For countries like Germany and Italy, this rupture is financially scarring.
Which brings us to this crucial point about cost asymmetry. Russia suffers more absolute economic damage, but the strategy is still fundamentally risky for Europe. Why is that?
The pain is asymmetric, yes. Russia will suffer far more. But the crucial question for the success of this is whether Europe's democracies have the political will to absorb their share of the costs. This isn't a contest of economic size, it's a contest of political tolerance for suffering.
Meaning Putin can absorb more national economic pain without facing an election than a European leader can.
Precisely. Putin's government has shown an extremely high tolerance for national economic suffering to avoid yielding to the West. In contrast, European leaders face publics whose support is volatile and whose tolerance for job losses and rising living costs is limited. If public support wavers, the very unity the ultimatum was designed to show could collapse.
So the entire gamble rests on the belief that Europe's collective resolve to absorb domestic pain, triggered by their own ultimatum, is greater than Putin's resolve to absorb national damage.
It forces European leaders into an impossible situation. They have to hope Putin complies. Because if he refuses, they must choose between two disasters: a self-inflicted economic wound that threatens their own political careers, or a catastrophic loss of international credibility.
Okay, let's try to synthesize this. The current situation is the highest stakes test yet for coercive diplomacy against a nuclear-armed power. The idea that economic power just translates into political compliance has been tested for 3 years, and it's failed.
This ultimatum is a profound reflection of the exhaustion of patience among Europe's leaders. It's a final, maybe desperate willingness to risk total confrontation rather than continue on this path of uncertain drift.
And there is a bitter irony here about European unity. The whole point was to show unified resolve.
That's the tragedy that could be waiting to unfold. They issued this to project unity, yet if Putin refuses, and then European unity fractures over whether to actually enforce the consequences because of the high economic costs, well, the ultimatum will have achieved the exact opposite of its intent. It will have exposed deep, irreparable divisions.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? I think the lesson is as old as diplomacy itself. You can design an ultimatum to force a decision and stop evasion, but you can't eliminate the escalation dynamics that short deadlines create. This 48-hour countdown is going to reveal whether Europe's move from patience to rigidity reflects wisdom gained from experience or just desperation fueled by frustration.
The fundamental question this crisis exposes is whether ultimatum diplomacy is even a viable strategy anymore. We're in an era where nuclear weapons limit military options and economic interdependence creates immense costs for confrontation that fall on both sides. The clock is ticking, and the result, whether it's compliance or a catastrophic rupture, will influence global politics for decades. The crisis has forced a kind of clarity, and that clarity can be terrifying.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. Stay informed and keep questioning the assumptions. We'll talk to you next time.